Before I start this video, I want to ask you a simple question. When was the last time you sat in complete silence and allowed your mind to run its course? No music, no scrolling, no background noise, no distraction. Just you and your thoughts. For a lot of people, it has probably been a while. And honestly, I don't blame you. We live in a world where almost everything demands our attention at all times. Even our downtime is rarely seen as real downtime anymore. We move from one form of stimulation to another. We scroll, we watch videos, we get notifications, we have conversations. There's just endless noise. We are constantly consuming that noise, and because of that, many of us never give our minds the opportunity to process what we feel, think, or experience. And sometimes that is what causes overthinking. Let me explain. I think one of the reasons why people overthink so much is because they never truly allow themselves to think at all. Contradictory? Maybe, but stay with me. A lot of overthinking is not just solely based on too much thought. It is caused by unresolved thought. Thoughts we never sat with, emotions we never processed, experiences we distracted ourselves away from before understanding them. So instead of naturally passing through us, these thoughts stay trapped in the background. And eventually they return all at once as anxiety, mental noise, emotional flooding, burnout, or just compulsive overthinking. We suppress ourselves constantly and then become surprised when our minds eventually force us to stop. And when that happens, many people instinctively run towards whatever steals their attention the fastest. Not because they're weak, but because overstimulation has quietly become their emotional baseline. Now, I want to be very clear about what I'm trying to explain to you in this moment before I get into this chapter. I am not advocating for hypervigilance, and I'm not telling you to obsess over every thought or emotionally dissect yourself all day. That is something completely different and, quite frankly, isn't really healthy. What I'm advocating for is what I call intentional observation, which is sitting still for a little while and allowing your thoughts to naturally rise to the surface without immediately trying to suppress, escape, or silence them. At first, this will feel uncomfortable because your brain wants to rush through everything at once. But over time, something interesting begins to happen. Your mind becomes quieter, your reactions become less impulsive, and instead, you stop operating from constant emotional urgency. So life becomes safer and you become calmer. Silence. Silence feels uncomfortable for many people because they are finally hearing the thoughts that distraction has been muting for years. When that noise disappears, the mind starts surfacing everything that has been left unresolved. That can feel overwhelming initially, but unresolved thoughts do not disappear because we ignore them. They wait, and eventually they demand attention one way or another, sometimes through stress, sometimes through emotional breakdowns, other times through unhealthy coping mechanisms. Your mind is always trying to bring you back toward balance. The problem is that if constant stimulation has become your normal, then your brain will start to use overstimulation as its primary method of emotional regulation. That is why having intentional quiet time matters. So, how do we have intentional quiet time? I call the process letting it wash over you. You see, when I applied that for myself, the first thing I realized that I was treating silence as just an empty space, a moment without stimulation that felt like I had to fill it. So anything, videos, conversations, music. Eventually, it took me a while, but I started seeing quiet time differently. I stopped seeing it as wasting time, I started seeing it as processing time. Because the mind is constantly taking in information, such as your emotions, your experiences, and your responsibilities. Yet, many of us rarely give ourselves the time to actually sort through any of it. We consume, we move, we distract, and then we wonder, why are our thoughts so loud? And then another thing I noticed throughout my own deep dive of myself was how connected the body is to the mind. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, my thoughts seemed to move faster. Everything felt urgent. Everything felt important. Everything demanded an answer immediately. But when I slowed down and focused on my breathing for a few moments, something shifted. The problems didn't just disappear, but the urgency around them did. It's difficult to think clearly when your nervous system believes you're under threat. Sometimes the most productive thing you can do is to remind your body you're safe enough to slow down. Finding silence. That was not the hardest part, surprisingly. It was staying long enough to allow my thoughts to catch up. At first, everything arrived at once. Old conversations, embarrassing memories, unfinished worries, my future fears. My instinct was to push them away immediately, to replace them with another distraction. But the more I observed them, the more I noticed something strange. Thoughts that were allowed to surface often became easier to understand, not because they were easier to solve, but because you could finally see them clearly. What once felt like a tangled knot slowly became individual threads. And as those thoughts became clearer, certain ones naturally stood out. And I understood, not every single thought deserves equal attention. Some of them are just passing observations, some of them are just emotional echoes, but every now and again, there's one particular thought that keeps returning. It could be a concern, a regret, a question, or a goal. Something that quietly asks me, let's understand it for a little while. Those became the thoughts that I paid attention to, not because they were loud, but because they were persistent. And the next one was obviously understanding. You see, understanding just takes time. It took me such a long time to learn this. We often want immediate answers, immediate clarity, immediate certainty, but the mind doesn't always work that way. Some thoughts may arrive fully formed, but others reveal themselves slowly, piece by piece, layer by layer, and I found that forcing that clarity rarely ever works. Curiosity works so much better. Instead of demanding answers, I started asking questions. Why does this particular situation bother me so much? What am I actually afraid of? What part of the situation is within my control? You see, the goal isn't perfection, it was just understanding. And at some point, I started noticing that just thinking alone wasn't enough. It gets interesting now, doesn't it? Some thoughts kept returning because they were waiting for a moment. I could analyze a problem from every angle imaginable, but if nothing changed afterwards, my mind simply kept looping back to it. That's when I started asking a simple question. Not why am I like this, but what can I do about it? Sometimes the answer was obvious. Have that conversation, make that decision, change that habit. Other times there was nothing to do at all. And that was also valuable information too, because if a situation generally cannot be changed, endlessly revisiting it often creates more suffering than clarity, because not every thought demands or deserves permanent residency within your mind. The only thing that helped me make sense of this all, for me to be able to even deliver this, was writing. Not writing for an audience, not writing to be some intellectual guy, just writing honestly. Putting my thoughts onto paper forced them to take shape. Things that felt tangled in my head suddenly became visible. And when they became visible, they became easier to understand. Writing became less like documenting my thoughts and more like having a conversation with myself. A way of turning mental noise into something I could actually work with. Over time, those pages became a map, not of where I wanted to go, but where I've already been. And eventually, every thought will arrive at some question. What now? Sometimes the answer is action. Sometimes it's acceptance, sometimes it's forgiveness, sometimes it's letting go. Eventually, thought has to lead somewhere. Otherwise, it simply circles itself endlessly. I found that the mind becomes much quieter when it learns that its concerns will be acknowledged, that its questions will be explored, that its emotions will be heard. Because when thoughts can be processed, understood, and acted upon, they no longer need to fight so hard for your attention. Okay, I know you may be sat here thinking, what if the thought's unsolvable? That's a great question, and I understand this, I really do. Some thoughts are not actionable, some situations are uncertain, some fears come entirely from overthinking itself, and in these moments, the healthiest thing you can do is to recognize that you have already done something reasonably possible, and then just allow life to unfold. That is incredibly difficult. I know this. But endlessly revisiting a closed situation will not reopen clarity. It will only ever drain your energy. Not every thought needs to be chased endlessly to be understood. And to conclude, your thoughts, just like your emotions, are foundational to who you are. Learning to sit with them instead of constantly escaping them is one of the healthiest things you can do for your mind, because peace is not the absence of thoughts, it is the ability to exist alongside with your thoughts without drowning in them. So, if your mind ever feels noisy, overwhelmed, or trapped in endless loops, slow down. Sit still, breathe, observe, and allow your thoughts to wash over you instead of fighting every wave that appears.